Why did you ask to see me?
Your mother? She came to see me.
Did she ask you to spare my life and what, you agreed?
Well, I promised that I would consider it.
And I'm supposed to be grateful to you?
No. She is. We're old friends.
You've killed a lot of old friends.
Oh, yes. True. True. Old friends in the day become fresh enemies at night.
What do you want in exchange for my life?
Why do you think I want anything in exchange?
Men like you don't give things away for free.
If you divorce your wife, well?
No. I refuse.
You refuse to divorce your wife, even though it may cost you your life?
My wife is my teacher. She's cleverer than I am. She's more honest than I am. She's a more compelling argument than I am, or you are, or your offices. I won't divorce her. That is my answer.
What you saw actually happened. If you don't recognize the characters, the man being threatened with death if he does not divorce his wife is the young Julius Caesar. Yes, the man after whom the later emperors of Rome would all be named. On pain of death, Julius Caesar defied General Sulla's order to divorce his wife, Cornelia, because he said, "My wife is my teacher. She's cleverer than I am. She's more honest. She's a more compelling argument than I am, or you are, or your office is. I won't divorce her." Caesar escaped death from General Sulla and went on to become one of history's greatest leaders. To this day, they name casinos and stadiums and pizza after him. Now, maybe you think, wow, Caesar was a really brave guy. Yeah, he was. But if you know history, you know that he was not a man of high moral character, which makes this event that we just viewed all the more amazing. What it really shows is that Cornelia must have been one amazing woman to inspire such devotion. My theory is that we make the big sacrifices in life not so much out of bravery, not because we're so special, but because we see something or someone so awesome, so amazing, that we say, no sacrifice is too great. If you're like me, you may wonder what or who could inspire such devotion in me that on the spot I'd be willing to do anything, even if it meant defying death. Today is part 3 in our series in the Old Testament book of Daniel. Today's message is entitled Dare to Defy Death. Daniel was a Jew, as we have learned, who was taken captive around 600 BC as a boy, taken from Jerusalem to Babylon by a mighty king, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Daniel and his 3 friends were wrenched away from their godly families back in Jerusalem to live in the thoroughly pagan city of Babylon, the greatest city on earth at the time. They were given the finest education available, but it was all done in an effort to brainwash them to abandon their Jewish faith, to abandon their faith in the one true God of Israel and the lifestyle that he commands, and so that they would adopt a new lifestyle, the Babylonian, the pagan lifestyle, and lead others to do the same thing. Though the situation looked bleak for Daniel, we have learned that God was working behind the scenes through the story to orchestrate the events for his grand purpose. And we've learned that the main idea of the book of Daniel, of the entire 12 chapters of the book, goes like this. Despite appearances, God is in control. It was true back then, and it's true today. And we're working our way through this great book of Daniel. Now, last Sunday, we saw that Daniel was raised to a position of great authority. Now, how did he manage that? Well, by God's power, he was able to recount the king's dream without having heard it. He was able to tell the king what he had dreamed and then to give the interpretation of the king's dream. And it was a great prophetic forecast of the world empires that would arise centuries after Daniel's time. In today's story, Daniel's 3 Jewish friends, who have also risen to positions of great authority, they are faced with a choice. Either they worship an idol or they roast alive in a blazing furnace. But they are so passionate about God's awesomeness that they would rather face that horrible death than deny the Lord God. How can we explain such passion? Well, we're going to look at it today. Our main idea of today's message, of chapter 3 in the book of Daniel, which is what we're studying, the main idea goes like this. Because God is so awesome, no sacrifice is too much. He's so awesome that no sacrifice is too much to ask. You know, often Bible teachers emphasize the bravery of Daniel's 3 friends, Rack, Shack, and Benny, right? They're able to face the fiery furnace. And yes, indeed, they are indeed very brave. But don't miss the main point here. The main point is not the awesomeness of their bravery, but the awesomeness of God. These 3 men are so faithful to God because they're convinced that He is so utterly awesome that He's worth any sacrifice. We're going to look today at 3 choices we should make in light of God's awesomeness. Those are the 3 points that you'll find on your outline. Point number 1, the first choice we should make in light of God's awesomeness is God's values over the world's. We should choose God's values over the world's values. If you remember our study from last Sunday in chapter 2 of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar had this dream of this huge statue that represented the 4 different empires that would rule over the earth. And according to Daniel's interpretation of that dream, the head of gold, represented Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, the Babylonian kingdom. Now, in today's story, King Nebuchadnezzar is so inspired by this dream that he decides to make a statue, a gold statue. He's so excited about the good thing that he learned that he turns it into an idol. Let's pick up in Daniel chapter 3, beginning at verse 1. And when we come to the yellow print, that's your cue to read along out loud with me. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials, to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, synthesizers, guitars, drums, the whole 9 yards, bow down to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue." Help me on verse 6. "Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the musical instruments." Little abbreviation there. "But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." The world's values, due to the corruption of human rebellion against God, drastically conflict with God's values. And here we see them sharply contrasted. You can't miss it here. On the one hand, God has given plain directives in His Word. You can't miss it. The first of the 2 commandments couldn't be clearer. Look what it says in Exodus chapter 20, beginning at verse 3. The first commandment is, "You must not have any other God but me," God says. And then in verse 4, "You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea." Help me. "You must not bow down to them or worship them. For I am the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods." Couldn't be plainer. Now, why? Why would God issue a command like this? Well, it's because the Lord is the only true God. He knows that false gods lead us astray. They lead us into all kinds of mischief and harm. They destroy our lives. We were created to worship and know and enjoy forever the one true God. Everything else is playing with poison and fire. He alone is worthy of worship and total devotion. These are God's values. But the world's values are much different. Back then and still today. In Nebuchadnezzar's day, idols often took the form of statues made of gold or stone or wood. And Nebuchadnezzar is like a kid with a new toy. He's so proud of his idol that he's made, this gigantic 90-foot-tall statue. He insists that they hold a dedication for it, a celebration, and he calls everybody together. And he wants everybody, when they hear the music, to fall down and worship. Now, Nebuchadnezzar at this point is a new king, a relatively new king. And so why is he doing this? Well, most likely he's doing it because he wants everyone to show loyalty to his new administration. And that's when an administration is most vulnerable, when it first starts. But of course, no faithful Jew can bow down to an idol like this. Not because of bravery, but because God is too awesome to betray like that. In our culture, idols typically don't take the form of statues. That's the case in other places in the world still, but not so much in our culture. Here and now in the United States of America, the idols are money and sex and power, personal comfort, entertainers or entertainment, even things that can be very good and wholesome in themselves, like family or career or hobbies, can be idols if we put them in the place that only God belongs. But the forces of darkness are very, very clever and subtle. Often the choice is not as blatantly obvious as it is here in our story. But make no mistake, God's values are incompatible with the world's values. And today, the difference is becoming plainer and more stark all the time. Just recently, the California Assembly passed a bill by a large margin that makes it illegal for anyone to receive professional help to resolve unwanted same-sex attraction or gender confusion. Let's say I'm struggling with same-sex attraction and I don't like it. I want to find relief from that, and so I seek professional help, let's say from a Christian therapist. This legislation makes it illegal for that therapist to help me, or even to recommend a Christian book. Illegal. This is insanity. And I fear that it could become a precedent for the rest of the country. Our culture is hurling itself further and further into anti-God values and beliefs and practices, which are becoming mainstream. A few decades ago, this stuff would be unthinkable, even for the most liberally minded people. But today, it's, oh, yeah, okay, well, that's the way things are going. I believe, folks, and I'm not a prophet, I don't claim divine inspiration, but I believe that if things don't turn around in this country through a revival, that maybe not in my lifetime or my generation's lifetime, but in the lifetime of our kids, we're going to see totalitarianism in this country. We need to pray against that. We need to vote against that. We need to be outspoken and loving and yet fearless in that. Now, I could tell you to be brave like these three men were brave. Stand up for Christ. Don't be deceived. Don't be fooled. Be willing to be mocked if it comes to that. Be willing to be held back in your job or denied a promotion. And of course, if it comes to that would be good advice. And I know some of you have suffered in those ways. But if you're like me, that advice alone, though you know it's right, it might leave you feeling a little bit intimidated, even a little discouraged. You might think, well, that's for the super saint. That's for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's for a guy like Daniel. That's not for me. The pressure is enormous. Well, instead, today, I want to shift the focus away from you and your mustered-up bravery to God and His awesomeness. Look to Him for the strength. Be inspired by Him. That, as we will see, was how these three men, Daniel, his friends, made it through this fiery ordeal. It was God. It wasn't them. Let's look at the second choice we should make in light of God's awesomeness. Number 2 on your outline. Faithfulness over personal safety. faithfulness. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had my say in the way I'm going to depart this life, being burned alive would be at the bottom of the list, all right? It's down there with getting eaten by a shark or devoured by fire ants or being crucified. Give me a nice, soft, cushy bed with my family around me and, just kind of slowly drifting off, That would be my choice. But for me to defy death like this, like these men did, it would have to be for something incredibly awesome. Truly, truly awesome. And I'd like you to observe that that's exactly what happens here. Let's pick up chapter 3, verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the golden statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance." Isn't he a nice guy? Probably because these guys, they had shown good faith to Nebuchadnezzar in the past. They had been promoted, and he probably wouldn't do this just for anybody. "I will give you one more chance," it says, to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. Help me. "But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" That last line is key. What God could ever do such a thing? "Certainly not your God," says Nebuchadnezzar. "I conquered him. I conquered Judea. I conquered the God of Israel. My gods are supreme. They have put me in charge. No God is so great to rescue you from me," is what Nebuchadnezzar is saying here. Now, maybe you're wondering, where is Daniel in all of this? My son, John E., came up to me after the service last week, and he's asking me about this week's chapter. He says, "Where is Daniel in chapter 3? Where is he? He's not bowing down to the statue, is he? He couldn't do that." I said, "You're right, of course not." Daniel must be on assignment. Maybe he's sick. Who knows where he is? Of course, Daniel is the main character in the book, is he not? I mean, he's in every chapter, and he's speaking and standing up for God in every chapter, but you don't see him at all in this chapter. Where is he? Well, I think there's a deliberate choice that Daniel is making here to just focus in on these three men, because it's so crucial. You see, these three guys never say anything throughout the entire book. They're there, you see them in different parts, but they never say anything until now, right here. This is their only speaking part. And I think Daniel says, this is so precious, this is so good, that I want to highlight that. He doesn't want to upstage them at all. Let's look at it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you." Verse 17, help me out. "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." The focus of these three men is not on themselves. It's not on their bravery. It's on God and His superior ability. Deliver us? Yeah, He can do that, no problem. That is not an issue for Him. He's way stronger than you or any of your gods that you worship, Nebuchadnezzar. But even if He doesn't rescue us, we're not bowing down to Him because He's just too awesome to betray. It's not worth it. Something has to be extremely precious to you to risk your personal safety, doesn't it? To jump in front of a speeding car, to push your child out of the way, to risk your life, let's say in the armed services, or for our country or as an officer of the law. Things like these are worth defying death. How much more so for our infinitely awesome God, who's not only all-powerful and all-knowing and all-good and all-just, but also who loves us so much that He took the flames for us. He went into the furnace for us. On the cross, He was separated from His Father. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's hell. That's what the essence of hell is, separation from God. He suffered and died on the cross to pay for our sins in our place. He took our hell so we wouldn't have to, and then He was buried, and then He rose again on the third day, never to die again. His name is Jesus. He is so awesome that no sacrifice is too great to make for Him. The world is a dangerous place, folks, in case you haven't noticed. If you speak up at your school or your workplace for Christ, even if you do it with proper respect and kindness, you're not getting obnoxious, you're being friendly, you're being respectful, you can still get whacked. Your reputation, it's not safe. If you commit to stay a virgin until you get married because you want to be faithful to Jesus, not just your future spouse. Yeah, that's important too. But to Jesus, you want to be faithful to Him. You can suffer for that. You can suffer ridicule. The dark powers that be will see to it. It's not safe. The world's values collide with God's values. You're up against our culture. You're up against the mainstream media. You're up against unbelieving friends and family, many of whom are sincere and mean well, but can put you in a bad spot. It calls for a choice. But faithfulness is worth it because of Him. Jesus is a more compelling argument than me or you or anything else. Let's look at the third choice we should make in light of God's awesomeness. Number 3 on your outline. God's protection over compromise. Does God also always rescue people the way He does with these 3 young men from terrible suffering and death? I see some of you shaking your head. No, you're right, He doesn't. You say, look at the many martyrs throughout history and even today. Did you know that more people in the 20th century were put to death for their faith in Jesus Christ than in all the centuries before that combined? Did you know that? And did you know that the 21st century is on track to beat out the 20th century? It doesn't get reported a lot in the news because, honestly, a lot of the news media think, Christians, they're obnoxious. They deserve it. so it doesn't get a lot of coverage. But people today are still getting crucified. People today are getting burned alive. People today are suffering oppression of various kinds or being imprisoned for their faith. Christians today living in some Muslim countries are facing hideous tortures and death for Jesus. North Korea has been rated the number one, the worst place in the world for a Christian to live, the most dangerous place. But this is nothing new. Isaiah the prophet was sawn in half. Paul was beheaded. Peter was crucified upside down. Jesus himself was tortured to death on a cross. And he told us that we have to pick up our cross and follow after him. Sometimes God rescues us from physical suffering and death, and that's wonderful, that's terrific, but sometimes he doesn't. In our story, Daniel wants to make an extremely important point for both scenarios: rescue and non-rescue. Let's pick up in verse 19. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "help me. I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God." He's getting the point here, folks. "Come out! Come here!" So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. It's awesome. That's our God. That is our God coming to the rescue. This is one of the spectacular miracles of the Bible. But it also raises a question. Why? Why did these poor guys have to suffer that trauma? And what about the people that don't get rescued? Why not prevent these guys from getting thrown into the first place? Or why not stop others that suffer similar fates? Why? Well, I think God is making a point here in this story, and the point is, the Lord may not always rescue you from the fire, but He'll always go with you into the fire. He's with them in the fire. You're never alone. This kind of protection is guaranteed to every faithful believer. Whether you burn or not, when you stand for the Lord at your workplace, or against the peer pressure at school, or in your neighborhood, or just in your private life where you are tested severely, God will go with you into that flame. He promises, Hebrews 13:5, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. Notice, Nebuchadnezzar sees 4 men when only 3 were thrown into the fire. Verse 25, and the 4th, he says, looks like a god. That's actually somewhat of a paraphrase of the Hebrew there. More literally, as the NIV has it, it reads, a son of the gods. The 4th looks like a son of the gods. You say, really? That kind of sounds like Jesus. The Son of God. Could it be that Nebuchadnezzar saw Jesus before his birth appearing in human form here in this case? Could that be? Well, first, understand that Nebuchadnezzar is a polytheist. He's a pagan. This is a stock expression. To say a son of the gods means a god in that kind of a context. To Nebuchadnezzar, this is either a god or an angel or some sort of a divine being. On the other hand, and this is important, God himself sometimes does show up in the Old Testament in the form of a man or in the form of an angel. And in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospel of John, I've written a book about this that's going to come out soon, this kind of a subject here. It's implied that these kinds of appearances were actually the pre-incarnate Jesus, Christ before he came into the world as a man. Later in Daniel chapter 7, we see this. It says in Daniel 7, beginning at verse 13, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. Now Jesus will identify himself with this prophecy in the New Testament. He frequently calls himself Son of Man. Well, Daniel sees this in a vision. I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, that would be from the New Testament, God the Father, and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Now, could this Son of Man that we see later in Daniel and later identified in the New Testament as Jesus, could this be the 4th man in the furnace with Daniel's friends? I believe so. We can't prove it absolutely, but it makes sense. Jesus is Emmanuel. Jesus is God with us. Either way, God's awesomeness is the point of our story, even more so than the bravery of the 3 men. Look in verse 28 and 29. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than worship any god except their own God." Help me. There is no God who can rescue like this. Hallelujah. This is stunning. A pagan king, a polytheist, the most powerful man on the planet at that time, erupts in praise to the one true God of Israel, recognizing him as greater than any of the other gods. This would be better than King Jong-un praising Jesus as Lord. I mean, he's just a tin hat dictator. But this was the most powerful man on earth at the time. The focus here is on God's awesomeness. God's awesomeness. But for these 3 faithful believers, the story has a happy ending. It says, the king then promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. He's got them there working in that place. Now, it may not always turn out like this. Sometimes God rescues us from the flames. Other times, he calls on us to endure great suffering. But either way, the final result is always the same. God, in the person of Jesus Christ, is always with us. Always with us. Because God is so awesome, no sacrifice is too much. Now, if you're like me, you're not the bravest Christian in the world. It doesn't take a blazing furnace to paralyze you with fear. It can be the fear of peers laughing at you, or maybe family rejecting you, or getting overlooked for a promotion, or just a pair of rolling eyes when you stand up for Jesus. Your furnace may be an addiction, or an inner struggle, or a relationship that you know is drawing you south of the border and away from the Lord. And you say to yourself, I just don't think I'm brave enough. I don't think I'm strong enough. I don't think I'm biblically literate enough to stand for Jesus. Guess what? You're not. But Jesus is awesome enough. You may not be strong enough, but he's with you, and he is. If you devote yourself to him, he will be with you in the fire. He's already done it when he died for you on the cross and arose from the dead. He is more a compelling argument than the furnace.